Thank you all for coming. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. This is a presentation about esports journalism, the challenges we face as writers in that space, and the opportunities we're provided. Hence, challenges and opportunities of esports journalism. The second story part I'll get to in a bit. But I'd like to open with a quote from Paul Gallico, a legendary writer from the golden age of sports journalism. Daily, I was in contact with those necessary elements of drama: good against evil, suspense, frustration, climax, and success. Every contest had its villain as well as its hero. Nowadays, writing from the golden age of sports journalism can feel a little purple and maudlin and theatrical. But I think it's important to remember that Gallico and his ilk created the world of sports journalism from almost nothing. So, over here in the fledgling years of esports journalism, we might want to see what we can learn. I'm going to go ahead and assume that the people in this room know that esports is on an uphill trajectory. According to Newzoo, who you just heard from, 1 in 4 millennials now watches esports. 22% of men and 15% of women watch esports at least once a month. That's between the ages of 21 and 35, specifically. Among male millennials, esports is now more popular than ice hockey and right underneath baseball in terms of viewership. More people watched the League of Legends World Championship in 2016 than the NBA Finals. The point is, esports is big, and it's getting bigger. It's not like writers up until now have sat on their hands exactly, waiting for the right time to start covering esports, but we do seem to be reaching a breaking point recently where the platforms on which esports are covered are ballooning seriously in size. Early in 2016, ESPN, the Roman Empire of traditional sports journalism, launched a dedicated esports section. They did have some run-up, like Mina Kimes' profile on Faker. But still, for one of the largest sports journalism publications in the world, and one whose president has gone on record as saying that esports aren't real sports, to make this leap had big implications. Simultaneously, you could see traditional gaming sites start to pick up esports as well. PC Gamer has a pro tab now. Rock Paper Shotgun has had an esports section for a while. Kotaku and Deadspin, working together, just released their Compete vertical. And even newer sites like Rolling Stone's Glixel have been covering major players like Loda and Hungrybox right out of the gate. We've also seen the arrival of a new kind of site enter the publishing landscape, the developer-backed esports site, which offers both official announcements while also profiling players and covering events, all under the watchful eye of a PR department. All these sites, an unprecedented spread, I think, when you have sport jockeys sharing a web page with game writers, are grabbing over some piece of the esports media landscape, which I would venture to say is still unclaimed. Undoubtedly, they saw the opportunity to enter into a $490 million industry, or I think more since I last checked. But maybe this is being generous. I think they probably saw something more. A chance to shine a light on and find new language for a whole new realm in which narratives of passion and excellence play out. I can't speak to the challenges they faced in that pursuit, but I can offer some observations on the obstacles I've faced in my experience. What that experience is, I'll fill you in on, but don't worry, it will be brief by necessity. My name is Roy Graham. I've been writing about video games since 2014, and that is not my dog. In 2016, I was brought on as the editor of The Meta, Killscreen's eSports dedicated site, which we launched in partnership with Twitch. And that's it. I did warn you it would be brief, which actually brings me nicely to my first point. Those of you who are game writers are probably familiar with some portion of the internet crowd not really getting the games thing. But in the world of esports, the divide between your informed audience and your casual audience is probably broader than you've ever experienced before. It's that divide that lets me, a guy with less than 3 years of post-college experience, be on this stage right now having opinions about an industry. So what do the people on either side of this divide look like? Well, let's start with esports fans. Esports fans are, by and large, vocal, devoted, and intensely knowledgeable about their pastime. They're usually experts in 1 or 2 games, which they play in addition to watching them, meaning that their understanding of them is very deep. This is one of the big difficulties we encounter writing about esports, especially when you have to write about more than one. There will inevitably be someone who knows much more than you in your audience. The history of the most popular esports and their corresponding professional scenes is not only complicated, it's nuanced, and it is very poorly documented. You can do your homework as a writer, but research can only take you so far. And if you screw up, it's very likely you're going to be called out, as I certainly have been. But you don't even need to get the details wrong to stir the ire of devoted esports fans. Tone plays a major role in this too. How many times over the last few years have you seen a headline like this? That'll win you some portion of the casual crowd, but it'll make anyone who actually cares about esports roll their eyes. Mainstream writers tend to approach games with this intense level of apprehension, as I'm sure a lot of you know, and this goes doubly for esports. You can blame that on our puritanical roots as a country, or on gatekeeping among the highest echelons of media writers, but it's something that we do have to confront as esports writers. Esports fans demand a lot from you as a writer, but this audience is also the most passionate. And in that way, if you're writing about esports in the first place, they're probably the most like you. They'll debate the hell out of you. Don't get me wrong, esports fans love to win, but they'll also follow you into the strangest and best places. Whether you're comparing the world of competitive Smash to David Foster Wallace's tennis epic, Infinite Jest, or talking about the architecture of Overwatch. So what about on the other side of the chasm? If you want to write for people who might lie outside the definition of esports fans, we run into a very different set of problems. To start, most esports have a big literacy requirement to understand what's happening that you don't see as much in traditional sports. In soccer or basketball, if the ball goes in the hoop or the net, it's safe to say it's a point. You don't really have to know a huge amount to follow what's going on. Even in the more complicated sports like American football, there's a level of cultural literacy that esports just haven't managed to achieve yet. I, for example, know what a first down is. I cannot say who ever explained that to me or when it was explained to me, but that's in there. Our first challenge is just conveying how these games work quickly and painlessly, but, and this is important, without being condescending to dedicated fans. Second, and this is easier now than it used to be, we still have to convince some people that these players are athletes. For some, the amount of money and attention generated by the esports world has been enough. They don't need more convincing. But that isn't true across the board. There's absolutely still a stigma against taking games seriously. This stigma runs so deep that many esports players themselves, people who have dedicated their lives up until now practicing, experience it. I remember interviewing Marcus Dyrus Hill, the retired League of Legends player, for Killscreen last year. Dyrus, for those of you unfamiliar, qualified for every world championship that happened over the course of his career. He's a legendary North American LCS player. When I asked Dyrus why he found such success in the early years of competitive League of Legends, his response was telling, particularly his choice of words. He said it was because he was completely addicted to the game. Addicted. I'm willing to bet that if Dyrus had been a competitive athlete in a major sport, that word probably would have been something closer to relentless or dedicated. Because he was an esports player, though, it was addicted. Can you imagine a championship fighter saying he was addicted to boxing? There's that stigma, that notion that video games are in some way a waste of time, even when you're better than 99.99% of an enormous selection of people. As big as the obstacles are, though, with this audience, the opportunities are at the same scale. Simply put, there are far more non-esports fans than there are esports fans. Winning over even a portion of the ordinary sport audience or the traditional gaming audience would do wonders for our reach. At the end of the day, there's no easy way to bridge the gap between your informed readers and your casual ones. But that is something that publications will eventually have to do if they want to remain financially viable. For a moment, though, let's forget about the finances. Let's pretend they don't matter. Because outside of audience goals, outside of traffic numbers, we actually have a bigger problem on our plate. We have to figure out what the purpose of writing about esports is. And I don't mean a broad corporate purpose like, connect with the youth. I mean existentially. Because while you can make a lot of comparisons between the world of sports journalism and this burgeoning new world of esports journalism, you have to remember that they really came about in entirely different ecosystems. The original purpose of sports writing was simply to inform people about the outcome of a game, or more specifically about the outcome of a horse race. Good sports writing did that vividly. It brought to life something that distant fans might not be able to see. Today, though, subreddits deliver the outcome of a game much faster than the sports page. And as for feeling like you're part of the action, they could just watch a live stream. Which brings me to my next point. Another big function of sports journalism was to give access to the athletes, getting to hear what they think and feel, what they're like, what they have to say. Now, though, Twitch exists. Esports fans already have access to most of their biggest heroes on a regular basis. They can see what they're like when they're bored, or anxious, or in training, or drunk, or whatever. They can ask them questions. They already have a more intimate window into their life than a reporter with a microphone could ever provide. So what do we bring to the table as journalists? What can we offer the world of esports? I'd like to quote here for the first, and you can hold me to this, last time in my life, Malcolm Gladwell, who in a conversation with Bill Simmons on The Ringer had something pretty insightful to say about the world of sports journalism. There is now a second conversation about baseball, the Moneyball conversation, that is interesting even to people who don't follow the first conversation, the one that takes place on the field. Same thing for basketball. There's an obsessive first conversation about a beautiful game, and a great second conversation about how basketball has become a mixed-up culture of personality and celebrity. Boxing had a wonderful second conversation in its glory years. It was a metaphor of social mobility. Jack Dempsey, one of the most popular boxers of all time, dropped out of school before he even got to high school. Joe Louis's family got chased out of Alabama by the Ku Klux Klan. That underlying narrative made what happened in the ring matter. So what can we offer the world of esports journalism? We could offer the same thing that great sports writers have always offered. To start, that means keeping our perspective broad, not tunneling in on what happens in the field, but making sure we understand the wider context in which all this is happening. Second, we need to maintain a certain level of craftsmanship and pride in our work. I've already noticed a fair bit of esports writing start to slide into mindless, hype-based enthusiast press. And we're certainly not immune to the worst tendencies of sports writing either. Vagueness, recycled phrasing, a certain cloying quality. We need to strive to remain great writers in addition to esports experts. And finally, we could use a bit of that myth-making that Paul Gallico was doing almost 100 years ago. Now, as esports rise in power, prominence, and popularity, I feel like we need this lens more than ever before. You can't talk about the world of competitive Smash without talking about this small, scrappy community's fight for survival against the very developer that made the game they excel at. When fans in the audience of a major Call of Duty tournament shout racial slurs at an African American player, that's not a random, isolated incident. That's part of a larger culture of intolerance surrounding the game. Everybody knows that the best esports players in the world come from South Korea, but fewer people know that that's because of the Asian financial crisis in the 1990s, which led the government to invest hugely in telecommunications and internet infrastructure, leading, eventually, to the PC bang. When you just talk about scores and stats, you're missing a fundamental part of esports. Usually, it's the most human, powerful, and important part. It's this underlying narrative, this second story, that we as esports writers should try and grab at. Because it might give us a bit of purpose. And it might be the thing which unites esports fans with people who just want to read a good story. Stock car fanatics probably enjoyed Tom Wolfe's thorough profile of their hero, Junior Johnson. But even if you don't know anything about stock cars, it's still a great read. There's something about a young bootlegger becoming a star racer that's almost mythical. And that's because the best sports writers, the ones we go back to over and over again, knew a secret. The best sports writing is only ever partially about the sport. Look at Gay Talise's profile of Joe DiMaggio, one of the best pieces of sports writing ever written. Out of its 8,000 total words, it has perhaps a few paragraphs devoted to baseball. It's a story about fame and the diminishing years of an American hero. String Theory, David Foster Wallace's second most famous piece of sports writing, probably, isn't really about his subject, Michael Joyce. It's about what becomes of the people who are trained from a young age in something as frivolous and as difficult as tennis. I contend we've done something similar with the very first feature we published on the Meta, Agony and Ecstasy at the Biggest Tournament Ever, by the very talented Justin Groot, which isn't really about the international as much as it's about the fear and anxiety that's accompanied the rise in esports power and popularity among its fans. Obviously, there's still a lot we need to figure out. But that's the most exciting thing right now about being an esports writer. There are a few landmarks to go by, but by and large, we're charting unknown territory. If I could leave you with one thing, it would be this. If you want to be the best sports writer in the world, or the best music writer in the world, good luck climbing that mountain. But here is a vibrant culture, full of human stories just waiting to be told. And we're only now figuring out how to talk about it. The best writing in the world of esports is still waiting to be done. So get out and do it. Thank you for your time. I'll be using however much time I have left to answer a few questions. Yeah, so feel free to come up to the microphone.
I'll ask a quick question. So earlier you alluded to the existence of kind of publisher-supported media outlets, like you had LOL eSports in your deck, and I was curious, as someone coming from a more independent outlet than a publisher in your case, how do you find the context of the meta's work being changed, I guess, by the existence of publisher-driven publications, right? Because now, whatever story you're trying to tell that involves, say, a League of Legends player is going to be in the same news ecosystem as a whole bunch of stuff that is created by Riot Games to tell the story that they would want to tell about that player. Sure.
Well, I mean, obviously that's a complicated question because I think a lot of the stuff that we're seeing in terms of like developer-backed esports sites versus like more traditional, I guess, publications partially comes down to I believe this to be sort of a transitory period in some ways. You can see even with like the recent PEA scandal, which was sort of aping the NBA in terms of structure, which I sort of thought was an inevitable direction for esports to go in, that fell through. So the shape that esports will take in 5 years is hard to say in terms of traditional media outlets versus developer-backed publications. But I think a lot of it, at least for us in the moment, comes down to the tone and the direction that we take the article and the sort of, I guess, where we put the focus. Because at the end of the day, while LOL eSports does some good stuff, they're fundamentally a PR-backed organization that are trying to, at the end of the day, make Riot more money, whether that comes from sponsors or from players purchasing in-game items or what have you. Our divorced perspective from that and our focus on, just at the end of the day, telling a good story and telling a true story, I think will always set us aside. I don't believe people read LOL eSports and the meta for the same purpose, in other words. Yeah, go ahead.
So, strange question here. Would you consider esports journalism an enthusiast press or traditional formal press?
I don't know if you can qualify the whole of esports journalism as either of those things. I think that there's certainly room for enthusiast press within the wider net of esports journalism, but there also needs to be a critical, sort of culturally thinking model like Grantland or Deadspin, which is less about like esports is so awesome, let's all like hop on the esports bandwagon, which, nothing wrong with that and it should exist. But there also needs to be someone being like, it's ridiculous how many Totino's products I see on a regular basis as an esports writer.
Do you have to write about them too?
I sure do, but I get to trash them in my writing, so.
There you go. All right, thanks, man.
Of course.
Hey, great talk. Just talking about you alluding to the quality of esports journalism currently. Do you think, my question is, do you think more conformity in esports as far as like the organizations and tournaments, would that help the journalism quality kind of persevere, or is it just solely on the publications? And
I think ultimately the onus has to be on the publications. When you see like ridiculous kind of shit shows like the Shanghai Major in Dota 2's not too recent past, I think that like at the end of the day, it's on the publications to write about that in as much detail and with as much sort of flourish as they can. Like I wish I had read more like elaborate 4,000 word takedowns of the Shanghai Major, more like paintings of this terribly run event as like Shakespearean tragedy. Until esports events sort of shape up across the board in terms of production quality, I guess, is what you're alluding to. I would just, the quality of the writing on them has no bearing on whether or not they were produced well, but the takedowns on them should be even finer and more glorious now while we have the opportunity.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
Hey, great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
How do you think esport journalists can help empower emerging new potential esport with much smaller community, for example, like Rocket League or Vainglory, perhaps through the potential virality of the article they publish?
Right. I mean, this is definitely this is a tricky question because, on one hand, you do have to balance like traffic considerations when you're covering something, but not every article has to be the thing that pulls in like 1 million likes. And I guess the short answer there would just be if they covered it. If esports journalists cover Rocket League, if they sort of find like the dynamic firebrand Towerfall player that wants to talk about how like everyone else is trash and like how she's gonna destroy the world, that's it's on just write about the stuff that you think is cool and that you think maybe has the potential to be something bigger and better.
Yeah, and if the community shares your view, I guess they'll just follow and the game will grow.
Yeah,
right?
I think so.
Cool, thanks.
Of course.
I have sort of a two-part question, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
I'd like to know a little bit how you think about like the fact that some of these sports are incredibly controlled by singular companies, and some of them do their best to sort of control the entire experience and don't really want anyone to come in and be a real journalist about it. And the other question is kind of how would you like esports or companies that make games that are potential esports to behave so that they can like encourage you to do your job as well as possible? Okay,
I think I understand what you're asking. So just so I can repeat it back to you and make sure I have it right. How do I wish companies handled their competitive scenes and their games, and how does like the fact that these are sports that are controlled by essentially one gigantic company factor into that? Is that about right? Well, I mean, obviously, access is key to a lot of this. I feel pretty confident that a journalist worth his or her salt can find the story, even if it's sort of being bodyguarded by like a PR person who maybe doesn't want you to get at a player's deepest, darkest secrets, as long as they just have the opportunity to speak with the player. As far as the question of like one company sort of controlling a sport and trying to control not only the rules of the game itself, but also the experience of watching it, it just makes covering it a very unique experience. But I don't know if it's that much different than like what the NBA does with basketball. I mean, you can talk about like patch notes obviously change the game more in League of Legends than they do in like basketball, but basketball still does get pretty regular small changes to the game, and there's obviously like the NBA and the NFL tried very, very hard to control every moment of a broadcast of a major game like that. So I hope that answers the question. Okay, thanks.
Being a person who plays Super Smash Bros. Melee and like how the different scenes are, say to League of Legends, so I'm very familiar with, I kind of find it interesting that people always talk about the narrative of the players, of the narrative, like the stories, and like kind of that would be the kind of, I guess, the second story that you'd be having. But in a lot of situations, the only people you ever hear about in certain games are like the people who are at that top, like the pinnacle, or in our case, the gods of the game, or maybe the top few teams, like, the TSM, the C9, or whatever. But you don't really see many people covering, like, say, Envious or something like that. And I was just wondering, like, in your opinion, is there a way to foster like some sort of narrative, maybe like a smaller scene or something like that, like maybe an up and coming player who hasn't really gotten much exposure or anything and is starting to travel or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess I think this again comes down to the question of like the journalist has to find the story in the first place. But actually, I remember we ran a profile also by Justin Groot on Axe, who is a great Melee player, but is not usually considered a god. Is not like one of the top 5, and the story just focused on the fact that he had like played this game for years and years, basically without winning more than like a couple $100 at a tournament here and there, while like holding down a job at CVS. Like that's as much a second story as these sort of like globe-trotting rivalries that you see in some of the major sports. It's interesting, it's compelling, it's got a human element to it. I think a lot of it is just that players or reporters aren't always given the time, or don't always elect to take the time to chase down these kind of stories and find as you're saying, the sort of smaller scale up and coming narratives.
And I guess one quick thing about that, the Smash documentary is also a big thing for Smash. I was just wondering if you had any opinions on like where documentaries kind of sit in the idea of like, I guess, journalism. It's somewhat.
I think a lot of the ideas that I tried to toss out in this talk can be applied to. I said writing a whole lot because that's my trade, but I think you can apply a lot of the same ideas to documentary. In terms of like the challenges of, I think probably it's easier in some ways to convey just how the game works in a documentary form, but you run into a lot of the same challenges and like obstacles, I would imagine. I haven't personally worked on an esports documentary, so I can only theorize.
Thank you.
I just had a question of what you thought as far as like casual games and casual gamers. They don't self-identify as gamers often, but my aunt is on level 2,185 of Candy Crush and probably plays it more than I play any of the other games I play. So, but she's like, I'm not a gamer. Do you think there's space, or are we close to where we would start writing about casual game performance? Is that esport?
So, can I repeat this question back to you to make sure
sure.
I have it right?
It's kind of disconnected.
I think I know what you mean. Do you mean that like is any writing about a game that is played at professional caliber considered esports writing?
Or could it, yeah.
Or could it be?
Or do we need to recategorize esports writing and call it something else to be palatable to the mom crowd, for example? Like,
I think that's an interesting question. Falling back on the idea of like looking at sports journalism for some clues there, you don't see much writing about like the casual side of like football or baseball, for example. But you have like college games, which are certainly played at a lesser level than the major leagues. Maybe that's where sort of more casual games could, or more casual like levels of play, I suppose, could see like profit in esports journalism, is like more coverage of like collegiate events as colleges start to pick up esports programs.
I think that maybe the secondary the corollary question is like,
Sure.
For example, if we found out that a 55-year-old woman was had a Flappy Bird's run of like 11,000 or something like that. So not played at a level, but literally someone who doesn't consider themselves part of the esports blanket. It demonstrates an ability that would certainly warrant that in the top 5 game.
I think that at that point, it doesn't matter whether you identify as a gamer or not. I mean, skill is skill, and that situation you described absolutely seems like something that esports writers should cover.
Cool. Thanks.
Of course. Looks like that is all the questions. So thank you guys. Have a great rest of your GDC.